Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining our webinar on the launch of the Forest and Finance financial data, both credit and investment, and also the launch of our updated policy assessment data. This webinar will be recorded and you'll be able to watch it back on YouTube afterwards. During this webinar, we will have presentations from Bart Warmerdam, Senior Researcher at Profundo, from Jan-Willem van Gelder, Executive Director from Profundo, from Milena Bernal from Global Forest Coalition, from Shreya Koshek, Research and Advocacy Advisor at Fair Finance Asia, and from Ghislaine Nadaut, Senior Sustainable Investing Specialist at Robeco. Please use the Q&A button if you have any questions. We'll be monitoring that, and after the presentations, we will dive into the questions and the debate between the panelists. First, I'd just like to say a little bit about Forest and Finance. Forest and Finance is an initiative by a coalition of campaign and research organizations, including Rainforest Action Network, Tuk Indonesia, Profundo, Amazon Watch, Reporter Brazil, Banktrack, Sahabat Alam Malaysia, and Friends of the Earth US. Collectively, we seek to prevent financial institutions from facilitating environmental and social abuses common in forest commodities. And we seek to achieve this through improved financial sector transparency, policies, systems, and regulations. Part of this work is keeping our website updated. So we have on our website, forestandfinance.org, you can research the financial flows from credit and investment to forest commodities of over 300 companies in the three main tropical basins, the Amazon, Central and Western Africa, and Southeast Asia, in the 6 agro-commodity sectors that are most involved in driving deforestation. These are soy, beef, pulp and paper, palm oil, rubber, and timber. So today we're launching the 2022 update of both the financial flow data and the policy assessment data. And I'll pass the word on now to Bart Warmerdam to give us the key findings of the updated data on the financial flows. Bart, over to you.
Great, thank you very much, Merel. And thank you very much, all of you, for joining this session, and also to our guests, Ghislaine, Shreya, and Melina, for joining this session today. So I will describe about Forest and Finance, a little bit about the research methodology for the financial flows analysis, and then some of the key findings. We have a company selection of more than 300 companies active in 6 forest risk commodities: beef, soy, palm oil, pulp and paper, timber, and rubber, in 3 forest-rich regions, which are Southeast Asia, Latin America, and Central West Africa. These companies were selected based on the size of their concession areas in those regions, and for some companies, such as in the beef sector, we looked also at the production capacity. This was done using public sources from the governments and ministries on the concession sizes, using trade journals and industry reports. For the financial flows research, we use a number of financial databases, Refinitiv and Bloomberg, which are well-known international financial databases used also by the financial sector. We use these to identify syndicated financing and investments in bonds and shares. Syndicated financing is where more than one financial institution participates in providing a loan or bond or share issuance underwriting service. We then use IJ Global for project finance and trade finance analytics for trade finance research. After we've used these 2 databases, we then move on to using company publications for bilateral financing, so where one financial institution provides loans to one company directly. Company publications, generally we use annual reports or interim reports, sometimes investor presentations, and similar publications and disclosures from the companies themselves. After this, we move on to company registries, particularly for Malaysia and Indonesia. For Malaysia and Singapore, this is an important source of information. And we also use media archives by using search terms in different languages and combinations of company names and banking these names to identify additional data, additional deals. For Brazil, we also use BNDES data directly and the central bank's data on financial flows from financial institutions to specific regions, and combine that with regional financing of specific commodities. There will be more on that on the Brazilian-focused presentation later today. There are some limitations in the data. We know that there are some gaps, particularly in syndicated financing is missing bilateral financing. So the financial databases, missed the bilateral financing. That's why we use company reports and company registries and media archives to identify additional deals. But still, depending on the jurisdiction of where the company is operating, there are still some gaps. For example, in Indonesia, we can find additional information in annual reports of listed companies, but we can't find any information in the company registries. And in Malaysia, we can find information in the company registries on companies' charges, loans, but not much information on loans specifically in the annual reports, because that's not listed. So there's differences in these jurisdictions. Additionally, when we find data in the financial databases, we may find the name of the financial institutions that are involved in providing a loan or underwriting service. But we can see the total size of the loan, but not how much each financial institution contributes to each deal specifically. So we try to calculate that based on the role that the financial relation and the financial institution has played in providing that financial service and the type of financing. There's more details on the financial research methodology on the Forest and Finance website. We also apply segment adjusters. So segment adjusters, because many of the companies that we research a number of the companies we research are active in multiple sectors and multiple commodities. For example, some palm oil companies are also engaged in rubber, or some pulp and paper companies are also engaged in timber. And we also have a number of agro-commodity traders like ADM, Bunge, Cargill, Louis Dreyfus, but also COFCO, Wilmar, Olam, they also have trading activities. So then when we find financing provided to one of these companies, we cannot attribute all that financing specifically to one commodity. We have to we adjust the value based on the proportion of the company's activities relevant for a sector. So for example, if Wilmar receives a loan for $100 million, and we've calculated that only 25% of its operations are in palm oil, then we can say 25 million is of this 100 million could reasonably be attributed to palm oil. We do the same with other commodities. So if it's $100 million and the company is engaged only 10% in timber, then 10% goes to timber. And if it has an additional 25% of its activities in pulp and paper, then of that 100 million, additional 25 million goes to pulp and paper. For the commodities traders, we look at the proportion of their business activities as far as possible in their annual reports. We also apply geographic adjusters. And this time around, the first time we've done this at a national level. So how much financing is going to palm oil in Indonesia per company, or how much is going to soy in Brazil specifically. We do this again using the annual reports, looking at the proportion of the company's business activities in the relevant sector and in the relevant countries. So what proportion of this company's palm oil activities are in Indonesia, what proportion are in Malaysia, and then we calculate an adjuster, so a geographic adjuster in addition to the segment adjuster, so we can identify flows to palm oil specifically in Indonesia or in Malaysia. For the traders, we look at, because they don't provide sufficiently detailed information on where they're sourcing all of their commodities from, we use the global proportion of global production values per country. So what proportion of global production in palm oil is in Indonesia or in Malaysia or in Brazil or Bolivia, what have you, Colombia. And we use that percentage to then adjust any identified financing. So these geographic and segment adjusters are then applied to any financing we identify. So we can say this is how much can reasonably be attributed to palm oil in Colombia or beef in Paraguay. So enough about the methodology. Now it's time to see what we found. So we found that in the period 2016 to September 2022, creditors provided approximately $270 billion to companies in forest risk loans and underwriting services, so companies engaged in forest risk sectors. It's important to note here that it's companies engaged in these sectors, not necessarily driving deforestation. The figures are specifically of financing to companies engaged in these sectors. Most of this, we see some fluctuations in these trends, with a high in 2018 and a high again in 2021 of both times $47 billion in forest risk financing loans and underwriting services, with a bit of a dip in 2020 with the Corona year. And the figures for 2022 are likely to increase significantly over the next few months as more data becomes available. See that approximately 20% of the financing is in palm oil, just more than a quarter is in pulp and paper, also approximately a quarter in beef, and about a fifth soy. In terms of loans and underwriting services, the majority of that, about 2/3, is going to Latin America, with only approximately a third going to Southeast Asia. A minimal amount of 2% going to Central and West Africa. Looking more closely at the financing per region, per commodity, we see that a lot of financing to Latin America is going to beef, soy and pulp and paper, whereas in Southeast Asia, unsurprisingly, more of it is going to palm oil and pulp and paper. So these commodities are more dominant there. Looking at the countries where this credit is coming from, the most credit is coming from Brazilian financial institutions, followed by Indonesian and Chinese financial institutions. The top creditors are Banco do Brasil and Bradesco, both of them Brazilian financial institutions, followed by Rabobank from the Netherlands, which has quite significant operations in Latin America. And on to the investors, we see that at the most recent filing date or information we had in September of this year, approximately the institutional investors held approximately $40 billion in forest risk bonds and shares. Slightly more than half, less than half of this was in, slightly more than half of this was in Southeast Asia, and slightly less than half was in investments in companies in Latin America. Approximately 47% of these investments were attributable to palm oil, just under a quarter to pulp and paper. Again, looking at the investments per sector per region, we see that the majority of investments in Southeast Asia are in palm oil, a little bit in pulp and paper, because there's not a lot of listed pulp and paper companies in Southeast Asia, whereas in Latin America, there's a little bit of investment in beef compared to pulp and paper, where there's more investments. And again, this is because there's large listed pulp and paper companies in Latin America. Going on to the investors per region, the majority of investments came from US, Malaysian, and Brazilian investors. On the Malaysian side, it's mostly in palm oil. On the US side, it's in various sectors. And investors, looking at individual investors, they include pension funds, such as the Government Pension Investment Fund of Japan and the Government Pension Fund Global of Norway, but also government-linked investors such as Permudelan National Bahad, and some international asset managers such as BlackRock and Vanguard. And I'll stop here and hand back over to Miel.
Thanks a lot, Ward, for breaking down those key findings. And it's a lot of money since the Paris Agreement was signed. $267 billion have been allocated to these forest risk commodity companies. I'll pass it now on to Jan Willem to give us an overview of the key findings of the policy assessment to see how financial institutions are protecting themselves against financing deforestation and human rights violations. Jan Willem?
Yeah, thank you, Merel. Indeed, policy assessments. We have been doing that for the second time this year, making an assessment of the policies of the 200 most important banks and investors as identified by the financial research. Policy assessments are published on the Forest and Finance website, and 200 banks and investors, financial institutions from Asia, Europe, North America, and Latin America, following the rankings you just saw in the financial research. And we have assessed their policies following using a rigorous assessment methodology based on international standards. I come back to that in a minute. We have given all banks and investors the opportunity to comment on their scores and give feedback and point to maybe policy documents we might have missed. And where necessary, we then adjusted the scores. This is the overview of where the banks and investors come from. 43% from Asia, a quarter from North America, Latin America, Europe are also significant, and smaller parts from Middle East and Australia. 200 in total, and we used 35 assessment criteria derived from international standards to see, to assess if their policies on these 6 deforestation risk commodities are sufficient to prevent environmental damage, deforestation, social issues, human rights violations, but also issues like corruption and transparency and legality. They are derived from international standards, from the United Nations, from the ILO, labor standards, FAO, when it comes to agriculture, and CBD, the biodiversity agreement, and the OECD, multi-stakeholder initiatives like FC for timber, timber and pulp and paper, RSPO for palm oil, and RTRS for soy. So, yeah, we took criteria from these international standards and then systematically checked if the banks included these criteria in their policies. So we gave 3 levels of points, 0 points if a certain criterion was not included in the policy, for if it was included in the policy, but there are exceptions. For instance, this criteria is only applicable to the direct client of the bank or the direct investee company and not for its suppliers. Then we gave 8.5 points to already encourage banks and investors that they are almost there and only need to expand their policy to require it also for suppliers. So these 3 levels we used for each of these criteria, but also for each of the 6 deforestation risk commodities: beef, palm oil, pulp and paper, rubber, soy, and timber. And we also did it separately, if applicable, for some financial institutions which are both active in banking and in asset management. We did a separate assessment of their financing policies and for their investment policies. So that means per financial institution, you then have a maximum of 12 policy scores, 6 for each of the commodities, and then multiplied by 2 because we separately assess the financing and the investment policies. These 12 policy scores are combined in one overall score per financier, because that is in communication easier and more appealing to combine them in one overall score. And we did that based on the amounts of financing and investments per commodity as found in the database, what just was discussed by Bart. We use these amounts as weighting factors. So if a company or a bank is active in all 6 commodities, but 80% of its activities is in palm oil, then the palm oil policy would weigh 80%, and the scores for the other 5 would weigh 20% together. And similar for some financial institutions are more active in credits, others more in investments. So also we use these figures, these amounts, as weighting factors to come to one overall score per financier, because the argument is that it is most important to have a good policy, a proper policy for the activities you are most active in. Then, what is coming out of this assessment? 200 financial institutions, 60% of them had scored an overall lower than 1 on a scale from 0 to 10, and only how much is it? 10% score more than 5, so above the middle point, the medium. So on one hand, it is encouraging to see that there are financial institutions, banks, and investors who can score relatively high scores, 7 or 8 out of 10, but their number is fairly low, and there's a big majority of the financial institutions which still need to develop proper policies. Regionally, you see differences. If you look at the average scores for the banks and investors from the different regions, from Australia and Europe, the banks and investors on average score more than a 3, which is still quite low, of course, but clearly more than the North American, Latin American, and Asian financial institutions, and not to speak of the institutions from the Middle East. This graph gives a bit, because we have 35 criteria. These 35 are grouped into 3 groups: environment, social, and governance criteria. Environment has to do with deforestation, water, protected areas, and so on. Social with the position of indigenous peoples, but also of workers at the companies. And governance criteria are about transparency, corruption, about legality also. If you then look at these criteria and how the different commodities score, then on average the palm oil is scoring a bit better than other commodities, but still below 2 on average for each of these groups. Policies for beef, which is the largest driver of deforestation in Latin America, score the lowest across all ESG criteria, all ESG groups, with an average of only 0.9 out of 10. Policies for palm oil had the highest scores, though still perform poorly in real terms, with an average of 1.8. So there's a lot to do among financiers, banks, and investors to develop better policies if they are exposed to these deforestation risk factors. They should take the consequence of developing good policies and then implementing. Finally, what are the best performers? I've grouped them regionally, taken together Europe, North America, and Australia. And you see the government pension fund from Norway at the moment that scores highest, followed by a number of banks from the Netherlands, the UK, US, Switzerland, and Australia, and one other investor, Aberdeen, from the UK as well. The scores for last year, 21, are put next to it. As you can see, there is some progress here and there with some of these financial institutions, but not so much. The ranking is quite similar to what we had last year. That is different in Asia, where you can see very interesting progress among some financial institutions, notably Mizuho from Japan and Malayan Banking from Malaysia, who have clearly improved their policy in the past year, which is thanks to engagement from the partners in the Forest and Finance Coalition, who have actively engaged with these banks. Some other, also CIMB from Malaysia improved clearly, and Bank Mandiri and Bank Central Asia, Bank Panin in Indonesia. So engagement with these banks, taking them along on this journey, trying to make them understand why these criteria are important, is really helping, and is certainly in Asia leading to higher scores for a number of banks. Finally, Latin America, also some progress, also caused by engagements from our partners. Most of all of these banks are Brazilian, not many important financiers from other Latin American countries, but you also see some improvement for some of the Brazilian banks, although still far behind the best banks in Europe, in North America, and in Asia. Well, this is it for now. Thank you. Hand over back to Merel.
Thank you, Jan Willem. It's encouraging to see that there is progress in these banks since last year. Still, as you mentioned, there's still a lot of work to do, considering that 60% scored less than 1. So we have more work in front of us. And I think it's particularly concerning that the policies for the beef sector are generally so low, like they don't score very high on that. So I'd like to invite now Milena Bernal, who's the coordinator of the Unsustainable Livestock campaign from Global Forest Coalition, who will talk a bit about the impacts of banks financing unsustainable livestock and how that causes deforestation and human rights impacts. Milena, over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Meryl. So I will give a brief presentation about the impacts of livestock in Latin America and the role of financial institutions, mainly focus on public financial institutions. I will just want to start with this picture that basically was taken a few months ago. It was taken in the Amazon River, and it's just a clear example of what is happening with the industry. Now it's really common to see a lot of livestock in the Amazon, where before it wasn't so common, or it was not normal to have this kind of animals in this kind of ecosystems. So it's a clear example of what is happening with the industry and what is going now. And also I want to link this image with some of the impacts that I will highlight now. So first of all, I just want to start with a brief overview about the current trends on meat consumption. As you know, the trends in meat consumption in general still increasing globally. This is really is impacting Latin America, especially because many of these animals are producing in the region. Basically, a lot of the animals and feedstock are produced have been produced in countries such as Brazil, Mexico, Chile, Argentina, and now also, and of course Brazil. As some of the graphics that we have found in the meat atlas that was published last year, it shows that the main destinations from Latin America beef and feedstock production are China, Singapore, Hong Kong, and Russia. But within the region, there are also some trends that are still increasing. So in terms of consumption as well, Uruguay, Chile, Argentina, Brazil, also Colombia and Paraguay is still increasing meat consumption, and also still increasing meat production. So just as an example, I want to cite what is happening with the pork production in Latin America. During these last 10, 12 years, around of 120% of pork imports were increased, and it's also happening in not only in Central America. It's basically happening in all South America, but in our case, Mexico is leading these trends, followed by countries such as Brazil, Colombia, and Paraguay. This is, of course, a trend and a data that have a lot of documented impacts. Some of the main impacts that we can highlight are mainly related to land rights conflicts in Latin America. As you know, many of these impacts are mainly documented as related to use of land. The main reason to promote the Latin American or conflicts associated to land use in Latin America are associated to the land titling, and many of these conflicts has been documented as related to the use of land for feedstock and livestock production. Also, the number of impacts related to water pollution, environmental pollution, and other impacts on. I'm sorry. Another impacts on human rights are well documented. In the case, for example, I want to highlight the case of Mexico, since there are some denounces that has been taking place during the last couple of years. One of these is the case of the Maya Council, where people in Mexico have been denounced the increased number of projects in the south region of Mexico. Basically, communities have denounced the impacts on water, health, people's development, rights of children to a health environment, and the courts have ruled in favor of these people, since the impacts have already proved, and the role of this private company, as for example Quequén and Cargill, have already been proved and documented as one of the main drivers of human rights violations. But of course, there are also another impacts, mainly related to women rights, as rural women depends on natural resources. Many of these lands that are used in Latin America, as you already saw in the previous presentations, are used for plantations and feedstock production and livestock production. So the impacts of these kind of industries in women rights are of course also proved, and it's also it's also possible to highlight that many of the women who has been employed in the companies used to get less payment, and are also subject to much pressure in terms of how they need to deal with daily tasks, family supply, and of course to take care of additional or at least to work in additional activities that are not being paid, as you know. Of course, there are also impacts on forest, biodiversity, GBS, Cargill are some of the companies that have been pointed as some of the lead industries in the region that are getting impacts as their activities have been proved as linked to forest loss and mainly violations to indigenous people's rights who inhabit these regions and these ecosystems. So just to cite an example, Cargill has been continues expanding their production in Latin America. We are really worried about the role of Cargill, mainly in Central America, since communities, not only in the South region, but also in the North region of Mexico, have started denouncing and documented what is happening with Cargill in the pork production and the links that the country has with new deals with Asian countries to export pork meat in the coming years. So this is just one example to see how fast are the companies growing their production in the region. We just, despite of many denounces and demands in national courts in Mexico and documented impacts by organizations, Cargill just still getting more support from national governments, and as we know, this will have an impact in the future as probably they will continue getting support from local and national governments. So this is only one of the cases that has been really taking importance, even if they are not getting support from financial public institutions. But in other cases, such as in the case of Marfrig in the last months, what was seen as a good or at least as a successful result from some of the efforts from civil society organizations were to was the loan that was stopped by the Inter-American Development Bank that was initially presented from to get $43 million loan from the Inter-American Development Bank to Marfrig to continue with Brazilian beef operations. But of course, as people has been denounced, and also investment funds have received many observations and compliance from another organizations. The Inter-American Development Bank decided to stop this loan in terms of reduce the impact that the project could have in indigenous peoples and environmental rights. In Brazil, it came as a result of an effort from more than 250 organizations who just sent some letters to the IDB and who also developed some additional activities around what could happen if this loan will be approved by the bank. So just to highlight, there is despite of these decisions that were celebrated and well received by civil society, the Inter-American Development Bank is still investing in livestock production, and it's during the last years there is a percentage of 150% of increasing on IDB investments in feedstock and livestock production in Latin America, especially in Brazil, as some of the biggest companies as Marfrig and Cargill are present there. But there is also another possible risk that has been identified by the Stop Financing Factory Farming campaign, where basically the Inter-American Development Bank is also investing in another company to continue with pork production that is basically promote or controlled by Norson company. So this is just an example of how the bank's international financial institutions continue having a role in the livestock and pork production in general, and how this can be how this can continue increasing the impacts in people, especially in women and smallholders, who it's supposed has to be an important role in the general food production industry, general food production system. But of course they are still lacking a lot of participation and attention from investors who are just focused on promote private interest, as were denounced before. So yeah, basically it's just a quick presentation about what has been documented and how people feels the companies and the livestock sector is impacting their rights in general.
Thank you so much, Milena, for giving so many examples of how the livestock sector, both the beef sector and the sectors that produce feed to feed livestock, cause huge environmental impacts, are linked to deforestation, but also to the violations of rights of smallholders, of women, and lots of other impacts, not just in the Amazon, but around the world. Regarding the IDB loan that was cancelled to Marfrig, I think it's important to note that these development banks have a really important example role in the financing of the sector. And I think it's really interesting that Marfrig cancelled this loan of environmental concerns, and just hope that other banks will become more criterious in their loans to the beef sector. To note that our data shows that since the Paris Agreement was signed, over $72 billion have been provided to the beef sector. And that's, as Bart pointed out, the amount that we can map, it's still incomplete. So that's, it's probably much higher than that. A bit related also to this, I would just like to note that yesterday, a group of organizations have notified BNP Paribas, a French bank, over its finance to Marfrig and over its lack of doing good due diligence. So this is a new step in the process of trying to hold banks more accountable for the finance that they provide to sectors that are knowingly involved in deforestation and rights violations. I would now like to pass it on to Shreya Kaushik, who's researcher and advocacy advisor at Fair Finance Asia. As Jan Willem has shown, some of the Asian banks have made quite some progress in their policies. So I'd like to pass on the word to her to comment a bit on the work that Fair Finance Asia has been doing in progressing these policies. Over to you, Shreya.
Thanks a lot, Meryl, and thanks to the previous speakers for providing such interesting insights, and very much in line with what Ward and Jan Willem had presented. Fair Finance Asia has also been working in this financial sector in the Asian region, and we've also realized that when it comes to the issues that are related to the environmental, social, and governance policies of the financial institutions, there are, and in the agriculture sector specifically, in Asia, if you're talking about issues like forestry sector, that ail the forestry sector, water, soil degradation, pollution, and etc., are one of the various areas where there is a lot of these are water intensive sectors. There is a lot of emission of methane, etc. And we found that similar trend that impacts deforestation is also observed in sectors which are related to mining and coal-based power plants. And we've seen that in that sector as well. Due to the COVID-19, there have been a lot of sanctioning of new coal-based power plants, which have added to deforestation. Like in cases in India, protected forest area has been sanctioned for the mining of for the mining sector, and there has been a lot of degradation. And similar case has been observed in agriculture, with the pretext and citing the reason that the country level energy demands have to be managed. Just to add on this bit, and Fair Finance Asia has been working with Profundo on various researches, and in a research that we had just launched this year, early on in March, called the Harvesting Inequality Report, which was facilitated by Profundo. We also had analyzed and looked at financial flows of 25% was primarily plantation sector, and palm oil was a major part of the commodity. And we realized that around from January 2016 and December 22, the companies that were analyzed, which were 125 agribusinesses, there were US dollar 2.6 billion of loans and underwriting were attributable to their agribusiness activities. And this was coming from financial institutions worldwide. And as Jan Willem had shared, Asia is a very interesting case. There were a lot of Asian creditors, which were the largest creditors, which were Japanese, Singaporean, Malaysian banks that had been actually responsible for this financing in the ASEAN region, as well as the 8 countries in which Fair Finance Asia operates in. So very similar to what we had just heard from our colleague from Latin America, that there are banks policies which are strengthening, at least in cases of the developed economies, or a little which are economically a little advanced in Asia, like Japan, Singapore, and Malaysia. You would find that there are policies in the agriculture sector which are related to environment, which are strengthening. However, the policies which are pertaining to the social issues are weakening, to the extent that if we take up gender as one of the issues, almost 90% of the banks that were assessed in the policy assessment, and these were 85 financial institutions that were assessed in that report, and it was quite evident that 90% of them paid very little attention to issues related to women rights and inclusivity in the value chains, which was beyond the corporate offices and throughout the value chain. The attention was really less. Similar cases were observed in issues such as for human rights and labor rights, and issues like child labor and modern slavery had a very ground level impact in the Asian and ASEAN based supply chain. What is interesting to note, and since we are discussing a lot of changes that are also happening in the ASEAN region, is that for the financial sector, there is attention that is coming in, specifically when we see international presidencies of an attention like the G20 that's happening in Asia, and we see that there is a change in the policy environment. Since is very nascent, and some of the countries such as Vietnam, Cambodia, etc., are very nascent to their understanding of sustainable finance and issues related to financial sector, linking them back to the human rights, social issues, as well as women-linked issues. We've realized that there are certain frameworks which are related to sustainable finance, such as taxonomies, that are getting attention now. Most notable at the regional level, if we see that there are initiatives like ASEAN Taxonomy on sustainable finance, which is actually seeking to create an umbrella framework which will harmonize other frameworks within the country and within the scope of the region. Even though the taxonomy is adopting a tiered approach, wherein the first draft that has come out is more sector agnostic, there is a focus on environmental impact assessment of the projects. One of the key objectives of the ASEAN taxonomy is already aiming to emphasize on protecting ecosystem and biodiversity, and this forms a very foundational based approach and objective for the overall taxonomy. But we are also seeing that at the next level, and the countries will have an opportunity to choose that do they want to go in for a more overarching kind of a setup when they're setting the taxonomy, or they want to go in for a more in-depth setup. In the in-depth one, they will be able to choose a more tiered approach when it comes to looking at the taxonomy in a more sectoral level, wherein agriculture forms a very primary sector, and agroforestry is also one of the areas of interest for the ASEAN. Since it's very new, it's still yet to be seen how well that will be integrated, but that has certainly added a push to other Asian countries. If you're talking about such frameworks, and we see that countries like Indonesia, Philippines, Singapore, Malaysia, they already have developed their country-level taxonomies, which are setting out to define what environmental implications would mean, which would define what are projects that should be highlighted as causing issues and do no harm principles. We see that a lot of, and we've been in discussion with our countries and our colleagues at the country level, who indicate that there are already plans for these similar initiatives in other countries, India being one, and we are anticipating that during the G20 presidency next year, there would also be one of the announcements of the sustainable finance frameworks and various policies related to ESG as well. So we've already been hearing that at the ground level. Some of the other notable initiatives that we see are the ASEAN guidelines for promoting responsible agriculture and forestry, ASEAN RAI for short, and we've seen that there is a huge uptake, at least from the business side, towards ASEAN RAI, and the aim is to promote the responsible investments in food, agriculture, and forestry, basically in the ASEAN, and there are provisions for reporting on these progress, what are the commitments that are being made under the ASEAN RAI. There will be minimum based requirements for the businesses that are signing up to it to adhere to. And there are essentially, the idea is to contribute toward regional economic development, food and nutrition security, food safety, and sustainable use of natural resources. So these are some of the points that kind of capture the ASEAN RAI, which is just one of the initiatives amongst the other ones that have been signed up by the countries in the region. And this has seen a lot of dialogue happening now, mind you, between the businesses and the government, not so much at the community and the CSO level. And this brings us to a very important point, that what is the room of improvement when we are talking about this engagement. And in our work at FFA, we've been observing that and advocating for this also. We feel that at a very ground level, the voices of the communities as well as CSOs is something that need to be better integrated. Just to take an example of my previously quoted policy initiative at the ASEAN taxonomy level, we've realized that the draft just came in. There was very minimal consultation specifically with the communities as well as the civil society. And in a recent workshop that we had in Cambodia, targeting at the Cambodian ASEAN presidency, we were hearing views from the businesses, CSOs, as well as the government officials that are representing Cambodia at the ASEAN level, recommending that there is a need for more structured and inclusive engagement mechanisms for the communities and civil society, such as a working group to intervene on the various policies that we are hearing at the regional as well as the country level. There is a need to have having a more robust environmental and social impact assessment criteria. And especially and most importantly, what we've realized, and that has been an impediment in our work that we've been doing, is the lack of transparency and the lack of publicly disclosed commitments that are coming in from the businesses, which can be achieved which can be achieved through mandatory policies. But we see that most of the mechanisms that are stated are now very, very voluntary in nature, ASEAN RAI included. So even though there are a lot of improvements at the policy level and movement that we are seeing, and mind you, I'm reiterating again that there are still a long time to see the impact of these, since these are very, very new initiatives. There is a need for the countries at the policy level to define their policy measures clearly. There is a need for developing more public access to information for the beneficiaries, and to actually build the capacity of the financial institutions at the ground level to roll out any incentives, to roll out even simple policies like financial inclusion, in which the banks actually rate really high. But to actually provide that access to the beneficiary is something that needs to happen. Hence, this twofold capacity building approach for communities as well as their ground level staff is extremely important. And that points that we've realized, and essentially overall the need of integration of human rights criteria, labor criteria, as well as the principles of free, prior and informed consent when large projects on plantation, etc. are envisaged. These are some of the points that definitely need to be taken into consideration when we are talking about complex market like Asia, especially when we are talking about shrinking civic space as well. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Shreya, for that very comprehensive overview of some of the latest developments in the policy development of Asian banks. I also hear a clear call for more regulation in that sense, to guarantee that these policies will develop, become strong in a higher pace, at a higher pace. I would now like to pass it on to Ghislaine Ladout, who is a senior sustainable investing specialist at Robeco, and who has been working on developing stronger policies for many years. Over to you, Ghislaine, to comment a bit on the role of investors and banks.
Thank you, Meryl, and thank you for having invited me to this session. Let me share my screen. Yes, you can see it?
Yes, we can, thank you.
And I really recognize what the previous speaker, Ms. Shreya, mentioned on policy development. I'm based in Singapore. And indeed, a lot of regulatory developments on voluntary regulations or policies in this region, but I will touch upon it later as well. Let me first quickly introduce Robeco to you. Robeco is a global asset manager with approximately 178 billion assets under management, US dollar, and we are based, or headquartered, in the Netherlands. Our clients are institutional investors and wholesale banks here in APAC, and we have a strong focus on sustainability. So we integrate ESG factors across our investment solutions. And we have a center of sustainable investing expertise that provides sustainability analysis, academic research, client portfolio management, and active ownership to support our ESG activities. And our truly belief is that ESG integration leads to better informed investment decisions. So why should companies, including investors, care about nature-related risks, including deforestation? Well, deforestation, it's clear, of course, can lead to various risks, physical risks, transition risk, liability risks, which will then lead to financial risks. So investors increasingly are integrating nature and deforestation related risk into investment decisions due to these risks that I just mentioned. And investors and countries have been taking action to halt deforestation. We have seen the EU legal framework to halt and reverse deforestation. And last year in November, there was a financial sector commitment on eliminating agricultural commodity-driven deforestation. So we see these commitments and legal developments happening. And what does it mean for investors? Well, we have to collect data in our specific data related to deforestation risk and integrate it into our investment processes. We are engaging with more and different stakeholders as well to understand, get a better understanding on the risks and how we can mitigate those. And if our engagement activities, which I will touch upon in a bit, are not successful, we have to consider divestment. So what is our approach specifically on deforestation? So we have a zero deforestation commitment. We set up a biodiversity task force who is working on a roadmap to measure deforestation risk exposure across our investments. So this is also how we are organized. So how it's related to the governance, you could say. We have entered in strategic partnerships to get all the knowledge that we require to follow up on our commitments. So we work closely with WWF, and we have integrated ESG sustainability in our company analysis, which is part of our investment process. And ESG integration, but then also specifically to the risk of deforestation. Then an important element in our activities is our corporate and sovereign engagement, so engagement with the companies that we have holdings in. And we can do the engagement with companies, but also via voting activities. Our firm belief is that exclusion is the last resort, but we have an exclusion policy, and related to palm oil producers, we have excluded companies, so palm oil producers that have that do not meet our criteria of RSPO certification of 50% threshold. So diving a little bit deeper into our engagement related to biodiversity and deforestation, we have various engagement programs. Nature Action 100 is one that will be launched at COP15. It is a collaborative engagement, so with other investors. We target in that engagement 100 companies, and the focus is really on industries with the largest negative impact on nature. In 2020, we started a value engagement theme. So that's a Robeco engagement, a bilateral engagement. We have targeted 12 companies, and the focus is on biodiversity loss linked to deforestation. Every engagement theme will go on for 3 years. How does it work? We engage at minimum twice per year, but preferably quarterly with the companies on the engagement. We have clear objectives, and we evaluate the progress on our engagement regularly. We also, as I mentioned, have our enhanced engagement on the palm oil sector. So currently we are engaging with 3 companies. The focus is on getting these companies to a RSPO certification level of 80%. So the companies under engagement are palm oil producers, and the timeline for is that these companies should meet that certification level by the end of 2024. And this is a bilateral engagement. So we do it as Robeco with the companies involved. And then there's another type of engagement. So this is corporate engagement, and that is sovereign engagement. Robeco is part of the Investor Policy Dialogue on Deforestation. So we engage together with other investors. So this is a collaborative engagement with the governments of Brazil and Indonesia. And the focus there is really on developing public policies tackling deforestation. And we started that engagement in 2020. This is an overview of that engagement, as mentioned, is in Brazil and Indonesia. And we are doing that together with 63 other financial institutions. So let me conclude. The financial sector and the asset management industry have a crucial role to play in helping to prevent further deforestation and biodiversity loss. Crucial role of data providers is there to support investors with high quality data. So this is something that we are continuously working on, that we get the right data and high quality data, especially on the biodiversity work. This is a challenge. And what's next? Well, we are measuring our exposure to deforestation and biodiversity, and we will steer on targets. We extend our corporate engagement scope. I was referring to our engagement, but we will also very soon launch our deforestation voting policy, which means that we have selected companies and with no deforestation commitment, and we will vote on the AGMs against the board if they have no deforestation commitments. And we will continuously looking into advancing strategic partnerships, because especially on this part, we also know that we have to work together with other investors, with other banks, but also with other stakeholders. And in that regard, for example, if we talk about development of taxonomies, I think that is a very good development, but indeed there should be a proper consultation. So this is something that we also can steer on. If we look at industry initiatives, such as the RSPO, Robeco is a member of the RSPO. There are several banks and financial and investors a member of the RSPO, but what we see is mainly international banks and not the local banks, for example, the Asian banks that are relevant, of course, for the palm oil and the pulp and paper industries. And as an RSPO and as the financial industry within the RSPO, I think we should do outreach towards those local banks. It's good to hear that there's a positive development on policy. So I think that's very good development, but it's all about implementation and transparency, and we can give guidance to those banks on this. So that was it from my side for now. Thank you.
Thank you, Ghislaine, so much for giving that very comprehensive overview of how Robeco develops its policies and how it also does engagement with regulators to make sure that there's better implementation of policies and that the whole sector raises its policies overall. We have now come to the end of the presentations. I would like to invite all our attendees to post questions in the Q&A. We can also open your microphone so that you can pose your questions directly to our panelists. We already have one question, which I'll ask to Ward. The question is how the banks or financial institutions, I'm sorry, I'm just realized that this question has already been answered. There was a question though about how many of the companies that are in our assessment have actually been directly involved in deforestation in the past years.
Yes, on the question of how many of those companies that are in the selection. So our company selection, we base our selection not on whether or not these companies have engaged in deforestation or other forest risk activities, because deforestation is only one, but also land grabbing and labor rights issues are also quite commonplace in agro-commodities. No, we made the selection based on the size of the companies. Then there's other organizations that have used forest and finance data to actually highlight companies that have engaged in deforestation and the links with them, the financial links with them. Global Witness, for example, had a report called Deforestation Dividends, which highlighted this. Chain Reaction Research has also used forest and finance data to highlight these links. But also on the profiles page, profiles part of the Forest and Finance website, you can also see little red flags next to the top clients and investees of the financial institutions we've profiled. And these red flags highlight allegations that these companies may have been involved in ESG violations or transgressions in the past 3 years, including deforestation, but also other issues.
Thank you, Art. I'd like to pose the next question to Jan Willem. You've presented about the policies of financial institutions, but there's also been talk about the role of regulators and the role of taxonomies, for example. What are like key things that regulators should do to advance the framework and to ensure that financial institutions are no longer involved in financing deforestation and human rights violations?
Yes, I think what the regulator should do is at least make sure that financial institutions, banks, and investors understand the importance of the topic and are dealing with these issues in a proper way by first developing good policies and then implementing them in the right way. And what a regulator could do is, ask for that type of policy development, but also ask for reporting on which progress is being made and how the financial institutions deal with the different issues brought forward. I think that the taxonomy development in principle is also a very useful development to give more guidance to financial institutions, which type of activities and technologies are eligible for financing within a sustainable vision, transition. But we have seen, of course, that with the European taxonomy, there is the risk of lobbying and bringing in, watering down the criteria because of corporate interest. So it's interesting to see how that will play out in, for instance, Asia, where you now see a lot of activity around taxonomies.
Thanks. Would anyone else like to comment on that? Then,
well, I think, the good thing with the development on the taxonomies, I'm based now for 6 years in Singapore, and I think this development has been definitely here over the last 2 years, is that, there's a dialogue now on this. So that's the starting point, and I think from there we can further strengthen it. But I think that is a good development. And of course, I also noticed what on the regulatory developments, for example, Singapore has launched the environmental risk management guidelines, which are applicable to banks, asset managers, asset owners, and insurance companies. They are voluntary, but it also works like this, that voluntary is not so voluntary. So we should not underestimate it, because I think it's quite powerful in the end. I think especially the MES, for example, is really also following up on the implementation. So the banks that are based here don't see it as voluntary. So I think that is also very hopeful.
Thank you. Shreya, I have a question to you. What do you think needs to change in the coming years, in the coming maybe 20 years, specifically for the Southeast Asian banks, to make sure that they implement stronger policies, or at least don't finance deforestation anymore?
Sure. Thanks, Mirel. And I had touched upon on some of those points that the time for discussing about being transparent was yesterday. We have to begin the transparency, the disclosures now. Those disclosures have to be clear. So if you're talking about issues in the value chain, if you're talking about, say, remediation issues with the community, all that has to be well documented. The time is past, especially in countries that are there in Asia, that we build the capacity of not just the communities to engage with the financial institutions and overall understand the implications of, say, a small project even coming in their area. But there is a responsibility of financial institutions to realize that they have to they contribute to this capacity building at the ground level, not just of their staff, but with the communities and civil societies as well. This might be a cost, but that's a very long-term business value that they are adding, if you're talking in purely business terms. This is one of the points. There is also time now to talk about indicators more specifically when we are talking about social issues and social risks. There is still a lot of need to learn, yes, from the countries that are based in Europe, but to learn from their mistakes as well. So if you say by the example of taxonomy, social issues were integrated really, really late in this, but Asia can learn and start that right now, rather than adopting a binary approach that EU taxonomy had. ASEAN taxonomy showing a tiered approach, but let's see, there is a need for dialogue, to have more multi-stakeholder dialogue. That is something that is non-negotiable, that should happen at the policy level. All stakeholders are equally important, and they should their voices should be heard. Business platforms, if you, just to give you a very small example, we at Fair Finance Asia have been engaging with the Civil 20 in Indonesia this year, and there have been a lot of challenges for us to engage as civil society, not just with the government and the secretariat of the G20, but also with the Sustainable Finance Working Group of the C20. Of the G20, which is led by various organizations, and UNDP is also one of the stakeholders. So even to bridge that gap, simple gap where there is a dialogue with the right stakeholder, is something that needs to happen now. And clearly defining parameters, because we have to realize that, yes, country level approaches are important. Yes, one size fits all does not work, especially in cases of continents like Asia and Africa, but there has to be something, a common ground within regions to work, where there some of the bare minimum criteria are non-negotiable, and those benchmarks and those policies have to be clearly defined beginning now rather than later. And regional level bodies like ASEAN have the responsibility to take this message down to the countries that are part of the region, as well as the plus countries to the ASEAN as well.
Thank you. Milena, we've been talking a bit about the Asian sector, but what about the beef sector in Brazil? What are like key criteria that banks should take into consideration, that they should adopt in their policies when they finance the beef sector? And perhaps a little bit adding to that, is it possible at all to produce livestock at a large scale in the Amazon or in Brazil in general?
Yeah, thank you, Meryl. So yeah, in terms of what is needed to take into account, I think first of all that to consider that there are more like 500 million of small holders and small farms, not only in Latin America, but around the world. So at the end, it's not only the work that Latin America can do, but also what the other regions can also implement to support this small, or at least agri-food production system that puts, or that place the peasant economy in the center. So of course, to consider, there are some legal frameworks, environmental legal frameworks that companies needs to follow, and that each different stakeholders and stakeholders also needs to consider at the moment to invest in these projects. So so I think this is also needed to consider that there are impacts that cannot be mitigated or under any scheme, and that public banks have to also consider there are risks that need to be addressed early, as they cannot be compensated in any way. In terms of livestock production in the Amazon, I think I think it's not first, it's not feasible since there are many indigenous people's lands that are now being titled, or at least many organizations and indigenous people's communities that have getting land titling. So I think it's maybe one of the most important steps to just ensure that people can get the land under right and legal titulation, so they can exercise their rights according to international and national human rights frameworks. But also, I think there are new advances in terms of how civil society communities are responding to pressures from different companies and different investments to continue producing livestock, not only in the Amazon region, but also in other regions, in other areas of Latin America. Since, of course, if the livestock production just stops in the Amazon region, it could also imply a risk to just translate this production to other countries that can also increase the problematic in other ecosystems, not only in the Amazon ecosystems, but also in another regions and another countries that can just getting that pressure of meat production and feedstock production.
Thanks, Milena. We have a question for Jan Willem, which is about if and how banks and investors commented on the draft scores of the policy assessment, and if that has any implications for future campaigns targeting either directly these banks or in general.
Well, the whole process of policy assessments, updates, is also giving us and our partners a good opportunity to connect, to link with financial institutions. So especially in the countries where we have partners like Malaysia, Indonesia, Brazil, there is good opportunity to go to financial institutions and start a dialogue because of the draft scores we've made. Then comments from the banks or investors are, sometimes pointing to documents we have missed or misinterpretations, but also often I think their understanding is increasing of what actually is expected of them in this respect. So these dialogues are especially important, not so much to give the financial institution opportunity to change their scores, but more to make them aware of what needs to happen, and then for maybe next year improve their scorings. So it's an integral part. The whole process of asking for feedback is an integral part of our whole engagement process, which is, as we have seen, especially in Asia, quite successful in bringing some Asian banks to develop a better policy. And that's a process of dialogue, which is important.
Thank you very much. And then maybe as a last question to Ghislaine, you've been on the receiving end of the engagement with civil society organizations in this dialogue. What do you think are the key challenges for financial institutions in general to adopt stronger policies? Why are some still lagging and not already adopting strong policies? In other words, what can we still do to make them move faster?
I think the regulatory developments, of course, will help to move, to get things going or starting. I think it's what Jan Willem just mentioned. The dialogue is very important because maybe there's not a clear understanding of what type of criteria should we apply or implement. And then I think there's a role of the banks that have some experience already, or investors, to share how you can do your due diligence, etc., so they don't have to invent it themselves. So because it starts with a policy, but then you have to do your risk assessments, risk management as a bank, and you have to build up capacity in that regard. So I think there the banks can play a role, but also, of course, civil society. And in some parts of the world, I also have a feeling that maybe they're not so used to the engagement with civil society. So you also have to build up that relationship, which can take time. But that's also, again, a role that we can share, or experience that we can share with local banks or investors, that have what the benefits are, of course, and that it's required to do that engagement with civil society, because only then you can do your proper assessment. Yeah, and then on the sustainable finance side, that might give an opportunity, but that's of course not so much related to the risk management side. I see that really different.
Thank you. We are coming towards the end of our webinar. I'd like to give our panelists each a chance to do some closing remarks. So if you have a burning question for one of your other panelists. Otherwise, maybe Jan Willem, could you make your very short closing remark and then pass it on?
Yeah. Well, I'm particularly happy that we managed to indeed convince some of the, especially Asian banks, to improve their policies. I think this is key because much of this financing is coming from these banks towards deforestation risk commodities. And what I would hope is build our network further, that other civil society organizations join us and work with these tools to put pressure on other banks in their country or otherwise.
Thank you. Ward, would you like to go next for a closing remark?
Yeah, I think I'd like to echo a little bit Jan Willem's remarks. It's great to see the developments in Asia, and also hearing the developments from Shreya and Gilene about what's happening in Asia. That's very encouraging, particularly since European financial institutions are drawing back from the region, focusing more on domestic markets. It's good to see that they're not leaving a big black hole, which is going to be causing a lot of ESG risk, but at least that the governments and the financial institutions are taking these issues more seriously. But a little bit concerned about the developments in Latin America, where we don't see such strong policies yet. I think also in Asia, you see such strong policies because of positive signals from government, from politics, that there should be stronger policies, that environmental and social issues are important to consider. Whereas in Brazil, we don't see such government signaling, and potentially maybe even consider that the government is signaling an opposite direction. So let's see what the results in Brazil mean also for the financial sector, and also how the developments of the European policies, such as on due diligence, supply chain due diligence, what kind of impact that will also have on the financial sector in Latin America.
Thank you, Art. Milena, would you like to make a closing remark?
Yes, thank you, Marielle, and thank you, everyone. It was really interesting to listen all the insights, really useful insights. So I think the most important part of this point is to really take from a strong critical view what the banks are doing, especially since the Paris Agreement and in general the climate change is imposing a lot of risk to people, especially people who are living in rural areas, indigenous peoples, communities, and those who depend on forest. So I think it's important to take into account that also each region is approaching the topic of livestock production and feedstock production different, because it also responds to some political ideals and also political views of what the region wants, or at least expects in terms of economical development. So I think it's interesting to also got this approaching of how different are the governments locally and nationally respond to pressures from other regions, and how civil society is being involved in each of these process that have been, or at least that bank or the institutional, the financial institutions are trying to develop. But mainly also to take an approach and to see close how each region are responding to the global demands on feedstock production, or at least livestock production in general.
Thank you. I'd like to pass it on to Shreya.
Thanks, Meryl, and I'm reiterating the point on the dialogue, and there's time for stakeholders, especially in the policy making domain, both at the financial sector level as well as the government level, to realize that communities and civil societies are a partner. And when it comes to engaging with the civil societies, it's a long myth now that there is no evidence-based advocacy happening from the civil society, or they cannot be knowledge partners or knowledge contributors at the policy level. There's a lot of evidence that's happening through tools like Forest and Finance, to the Fair Finance Guide methodology that we have in the Fair Finance Network, and the evidence-based research that are created from these country level as well as regional level researches that are created from these tools are very much have the value to be influenced and the value to provide input, as well as to some extent provide the indicators as well as materiality for various issues and risks that we are discussing. And it's time that civil society are also taken on board, not just as raising voice of the community, but as knowledge partners as well, which will actually help in creating that ease of communication between the various stakeholders that are there and set the rules of the games.
Thank you for that call for more dialogue. Ghislaine, would you like to make a final comment?
Well, thank you all for, I learned a lot during this webinar, but actually I wanted to mention indeed the comment that Shreya made also in her first contribution, that there is mainly a dialogue between government and companies, for example, related on the taxonomies, and that there is not enough consultation or strong consultation with the CSO with the civil society. This is really a point that I will take with me, and also to try to make sure that we push that there's more civil society voices heard. Yeah.
Thank you. Then I'd like to thank all our panelists for participating today and for contributing to this rich debate, presenting the data and presenting all the work that you do. We will be sharing the recording and the PowerPoints that were shared today with those who participated today, and we'll also be posting the recording of this webinar on our YouTube channel, so you can watch it back afterwards. Thank you all very much, and I wish you all a good day.